Welcome to the Kolbecast, episode 290. Thank you for joining us. Today we are joined by theologian, author, speaker, podcaster, and homeschooling father, Brett Salkeld. After his book, Making Every Class Catholic, came out in 2023, Brett has been speaking to schools about how to make sure that every class is authentically Catholic. We discuss how this can be implemented in the homeschooling setting, along with many interesting discussions about the integration of theology, philosophy, and the natural sciences. We hope that you'll enjoy the show.
Hi there, I'm Bonnie, Kolbe homeschooling mom of 4 lads and lasses, liturgical musician, popcorn, and podcast fanatic.
And this is Stephen, homeschooling father of 5 and director of development for Kolbe Academy.
Hi, Stephen, how are you?
Doing well. I'm kind of a single parent for the week while my wife is gone. So I'm anticipating that as soon as we get like 10 minutes in, the dogs are going to be barking and there's going to be craziness going all over the place. But we'll see. We'll see. I might be pleasantly surprised.
The signal will go out. Right.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yep.
And I think a lot of folks can relate to that. Yep. Well, I am fairly comfortable positing that many or most of our Kolbe families are homeschooling largely, or at least partly, in order to keep their Catholic faith front and center in their daily educational and life doings. Homeschooling, of course, being any number of ways, especially with Kolbe, with our mix and match way of delivering curriculum and undertaking the educational doings and so forth. Our guest today is Dr. Brett Salkeld, a theologian, author, speaker, and podcaster who's on a mission to make every class Catholic. Hi, Dr. Salkeld. Welcome to the Kolbecast.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Oh, it's great to visit with you. Our teachers got to spend some time with you earlier in the school year as that was getting underway this year. So it's our turn today. So would you tell us about yourself and your background and so forth?
Yeah, I'm a theologian up here in Canada, Regina, Saskatchewan. I work for the Archdiocese here, and this is where I grew up in a small town in the Archdiocese, a village, in fact. My wife and I live here with our 7 children, most of whom were homeschooled most of the time. We've got a kind of a mix and a match thing. We've got one kid in a private Christian school. We've got one kid at the local publicly funded Catholic high school. We have those in Saskatchewan. We've got 4 currently at home. All of them have been homeschooled at some point or other. So we have an experience of a wide variety of approaches to schooling. And I was trained as a teacher. Before I went on to be a theologian, I was trained as a history and math teacher. So I have that in my background. My mom was an elementary school teacher in the small town next to our village where we got bused to school after our little K-3 school. Either we finished grade 3 or if you were one of my younger siblings after the school closed. So, yeah.
Okay, there's so much interesting to me. So I'm going to try to keep my focus here. So as a homeschooling parent, what stands out in your mind? What standout memories from homeschooling could be happy, cautionary, a mix of them, so forth?
I think for us, the best thing about homeschooling was the freedom to teach what we wanted our kids to learn, but actually like the freedom to structure your day and your relationships. Like when my wife talks about her choice to homeschool the kids that she did when she did, her big thing wasn't like, oh, the schools are bad, they're teaching wrong things or whatever. It was like, I want to build a family culture, and that's hard to do when people aren't in my house. So it was a big part of it was trying to have siblings who have healthy relationships with each other, who know each other, who enjoy each other's company. That was a big part of what we were doing. From a content point of view, I think a lot of it allowed us real freedom to just explore. If kids are interested, like one of the wild things, so they have things they have to do. Mama has a checklist, you got to learn your reading and writing and arithmetic stuff. But like one day, one of the kids said like, Dad, how does milk become cheese? And I had a vague idea, but I couldn't give a very professional sort of answer on that. So we watched a YouTube video. Well, then you know how YouTube works. It's like, oh, you like cheese? Well, let me tell you about cheese, right?
Right.
So we went on this like cheese kick for like 2 months. every night the reward, if you got ready for bed in time, is we found like this series. Someone was traveling around Europe, visiting all these places where they make special local cheese. So you learn about Gouda and mozzarella and brie and whatever. And so what we would do, if you were good, then before bed we could sit down and watch an 8-minute video about cheese. And then I'd watch for sales at the grocery store, and we tried, Manchego and whatever, all these different cheeses. And now we know lots about cheese, and like, who cares? In one sense, it's not essential information. But what was really great was they learned. I mean, they learned things that are interesting for their own sake, right? About animals and geography and climate and all this kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
And culture actually, but then also they learned that the world is interesting and that there's more than meets the eye. And if you go digging, you're going to find stuff that's fascinating, and that this thing is connected to this other thing is connected to this other thing. And so it was just, you could do it with cheese, you could do it with anything else, doesn't matter. The point was that you engage in this practice of like wonder and curiosity, and we had a ton of fun. Like, they have this sense that learning is fun, not the sense that learning is work. Of course, they have to do work, and sometimes it's hard to make them do their math homework. Like, it's not a perfect ideal situation. We're still sinners. Our kids are still sinners. We still have days where I come home and Mama's like, "Oh my gosh, what am I going to do with these children?" But in general, this freedom to just explore the world creatively, with curiosity, with wonder, that was a really big thing for us, I think, and one of the things we love most about homeschooling when that's what we're doing with, and even the kids who are off at school, that's still part of our culture at home. Like, when they come home, that's still how it works. That's it. In fact, one of the first conversations we had when the kids were really little, about homeschooling, was we were already teaching them stuff before they were school aged, and we just realized we are homeschooling, and we would keep homeschooling even if they went to school. Like, that's just like, what else are you going to do with kids? You're going to teach them how to play chess. You're going to teach them how to check their bank account and see what's happening. Like, you're just going to teach them things all the time. That's what you do. So
Very true. What does your day to day as a diocesan theologian look like?
Oh, it's all over the map. Yeah, it's this. So my main task for a long time was I was director of our diocesan diaconate formation program. So that was my single biggest file, and so I have to organize the formation weekends and reach out to the presenters, and I had to do a lot of teaching and preparation for teaching and all that kind of stuff myself. And that's currently on a bit of hiatus. We ordained our second class a year and a half ago, and we're in discernment about when there will be a third cohort.
Okay.
I do lots. We recorded a podcast here this morning, a diocesan podcast, Thinking Faith, which your listeners might be interested in. I write things. I consult. Right now, I'm the bishop's liaison for a group of parents here that are interested in starting a Chesterton Academy. So that's something I've been doing recently. When things happen like pandemics or the law in Canada that the law against assisted suicide was struck down. So then I have to become an expert in whatever's happening. Gender stuff, became a very pressing question in our schools and beyond the schools. So I have to be very responsive. I have to learn a lot. I had to learn a lot about vaccines and church teaching on what is technically called cooperation with evil and all this kind of stuff. I had to learn a lot about gender. I had to learn a lot about assisted suicide. So it's a very responsive kind of thing, which is actually how I ended up writing this book for Catholic teachers, because I was doing a lot of work with teachers, teachers and aspiring teachers, ed students who were in our local Catholic college. They're ed students at the secular university, but they could take one elective at the Catholic college, and I taught that, and that's kind of part of what led to the book. So yeah, all kinds of different things I end up doing here. I do lots of presentations for like OCIA, marriage prep, our local lay formation program, our spiritual directors program. I'll do evening or weekend talks at parishes or different things like that. So
Seems like you're setting a good example for what you just described as your homeschooling experience there, as far as always something new that you're discovering and delving into.
Yeah, I'm lucky because I'm a bit of a generalist. I mean, I have a PhD in theology, so I'm a specialist in one sense, but by nature I'm a generalist. I just find everything interesting, and so this work allows me to, yeah, constantly be learning new things, and trying to help other people make sense of their questions, you know,
Right.
that come from their faith, but in light of what's happening in the world.
That makes sense, and it's probably another aim of many families listening. I know you're widely published online, several books, and all your writing and speaking, and yes, multiple podcasts. So we want to hear more about those. Your current project is making every class Catholic. Is that an accurate way to describe it? Is that your current project? I know it's a
Yeah.
fairly recent project, so tell us about that.
Yeah, so I published a book in February 2023 with our Sunday visitor called Educating for Eternity, A Teacher's Companion for Making Every Class Catholic, which grew, as I mentioned, out of my work here with aspiring Catholic teachers and also with some existing, like, working Catholic teachers. And it kind of caught fire. I was just up here in the north. I didn't know what was going on down there. But as it turns out, Catholic schools all across North America have been labeling this idea. It goes under a lot of different names: Catholic academic integration, curriculum permeation, infusing or imbuing your teaching with a Catholic worldview. Doesn't matter what you call it, but they were all after this idea that the way you teach something should be informed by a Catholic worldview. That the secular perspective that pervades most education is not neutral. It's making real claims about the human person and what life is about. And even if it says you get to decide for yourself what life is about, that's not neutral. Actually, that's a claim. It's a pretty substantive one, and it's one that has real consequences in terms of our kids' ability to make meaning, and or discern meaning in their lives. In fact, it feels a lot like handcuffs because they're just sort of trapped. Like, oh, I'm supposed to make this up. Well, whatever I make up, I know I made it up, so it actually won't serve the purpose. You actually can't fill meaning with something you made up. Anyways, it's not a neutral position, and people intuited more and more in the last, I'd say, decade and a half, that the secular view that was imbuing our curriculum was not neutral, and that we needed to be intentional about a Catholic worldview. But there hadn't been a lot of theoretical foundation done on what that means, and so you got lots of different attempts at it of varying degrees of success. But one real concern was that a lot of it felt kind of tacked on. Like, we'll just have some Catholic math problems, or like, if we read good Catholic literature, like, by all means, I'm all for it. Let's read good Catholic literature. But let's not imagine that, like, that's all that's what it means to have a Catholic approach to literature. Like, Catholics should be able to read non-Catholic literature from a Catholic point of view and seek goodness and truth and beauty wherever we can find it, and critique error wherever we can find it, but not just imagine us as sort of sectarian, you know. Anyways, so I tried doing that work, and it sort of caught on because there was a real gap in the market, for lack of a better way to describe it. And so since the book caught on, I've been trying to support Catholic educators as much as I can with podcasts. I have a new newsletter on Substack. I just released a second one the other day. Various online platforms, working with all kinds of people, including homeschooling groups like Kolbe, both through this podcast and through some formation for your educators. Yeah, so I think it's very accurate to say my new project is, or my current project is, making every class Catholic, and I travel all over speaking to schools and dioceses and all that kind of stuff as well.
Some of these ideas, I mean, I think what you talk, well, we'll find out more about what you cover in your book, but some of these things started to come up with me, mostly, I think, in the sciences, like back in the late 90s, early 2000s, when I was looking at Aristotelian philosophy and Thomistic thought, And then it's like, I love Einstein though. And how does what Aristotle says about this combine or make sense with what Einstein's talking about here? So there were conversations going on, but there weren't many answers. And I really didn't actually have I'm not a theoretical physicist or anything to really be delving into these things. But more and more I'm seeing, like we had Dr. Daniel Kuebler from Franciscan talking about bringing together evolution and Thomistic thought. And, at Divine Mercy University, they've got their Catholic Christian meta model of the person, which is combining psychology and Thomistic thought and Aristotelian. So I'm seeing more and more of this, like especially it's easier to see some for me sometimes in modern science, because it's like the questions they're asking are not the same questions that we're talking about over possibly in a natural philosophy or a theological standpoint. But as Catholics, we know the truths. We have this rich philosophical background, and then there's other stuff. So why
Right.
aren't we mushing them all together? That's the
Right, right. The Divine Mercy University book you mentioned, if people could see my bookshelf, it's just right over there. And as you were talking, I thought of another one that's just over there. It's Aquinas and Modern Science. Uh, and so this stuff is starting to happen. One of the really key things uh, to do this integration work is to recognize that philosophy and theology answer different kinds of questions than psychology and natural sciences. But very often in their contemporary guise, psychology or the natural sciences will pretend to offer answers to these that are properly philosophical or theological, uh, and then you end up with real confusion. Uh, and so, the medieval church often talked about theology as the queen of the sciences. Well, that doesn't just mean it's better than all the others, but it actually means it's sort of the integrating center that helps you make sense of all the others. It's the lens through which you see the other things. So it's not simply a matter of like trying to do a compare and contrast between what we learn from science and what we learn from theology and see if there's like some kind of complementarity or contradiction, but rather just recognize that there's different kinds of questions. One of the ways I put it when I'm working with science teachers is that science teaches us how things work, and philosophy and theology teach us why it matters and what it means. And those are two different kinds of questions. I recently saw something, we were taking some questions from students on our podcast, our diocesan podcast. And it was a question about abortion that started with the premise scientifically, it's just a group of a clump. Scientifically, it's just a clump of cells. Therefore, you know what follows from this. Well, okay, in one sense, scientifically, it is a clump of cells, and so are you. So science, the question is science equipped to answer what the value of a given clump of cells is? Well, no, that's like science can tell us that this is made of cells. Okay, great. So snails are made of cells and humans are made of cells, whether they're in utero or somewhere else. But the value question, what is this clump of cells and why does it mean anything? And why should it be treated in this way and not that way? It's just not a science question. And it misunderstands the whole structure of knowing to imagine that you could say scientifically it's a clump of cells, which is accurate, but also completely misleading if it's framed as if that answers a philosophical question that says it has no value, right? So a lot of this work gets really much easier to do if you recognize that the different disciplines have their appropriate methodology that's appropriate to the questions they're designed to answer, and you kind of stay in your lane. But then you have higher order questions that allow you to integrate knowledge across disciplines. And the church is clear. At Vatican II, there's a quote about respecting the methodological independence of different disciplines, especially the natural sciences. So we're all in favor of that. But that doesn't mean that they somehow get a trump card, right?
right.
On questions about meaning,
Yes,
on
yes.
which they're completely inadequate to the task, right?
Boy, when you were saying the clump of cells, it's just like, well, sir, why did you murder that person? You can say, well, no, I didn't. What are you talking about? It was just a clump of cells.
Right.
I just shot a bullet into that clump of cells over there, and I don't know what happened.
Right.
So
Right. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Exactly.
right.
Exactly.
That's interesting.
how do you find folks to be receptive to for the meaning aspect? Like science can't answer the meaning part, and it's still important to answer that. Do you find that to be, uh, do folks recognize that?
Yeah, in the circles where I've presented, uh, I mean, I'm sure there are people who don't share my worldview who would push back because they do. I mean, you can watch them on YouTube. Although the new atheists are past their heyday, it's worth noting. I mean, their project seems to have largely failed, right? So this contention that science is adequate to the task of answering all of life's questions in the last 2 or 3 years, I mean, it was in decline before, but it's like very clear now that that was an inadequate response, that it looked like it was going to sweep away all our young people, and now it's just not working. And you have lots of stories of young people who kind of bought into that for a season, and then when life happened, it was just completely inadequate, right? So that worldview is not in the ascendant anymore. But I'm sure there's still people who would push back on me. But where I work with Catholic educators, you get, science teachers who are committed to the methodological independence of science, and I want to give them two thumbs up for that. That's what we want to do. Uh, when I introduce them to the fact that the way I say it to them that really resonates, I say science questions deserve science answers, but there are questions about science that are not science questions. And if we can recognize that distinction, both of them are rightly matter for discussion in a science class, but they're two different kinds of things, and we should treat them as such. And when I say that, I have not had any pushback at all. Like, they get it, and in fact, it gives them freedom because they're worried when they're invited to teach from a Catholic point of view. They're worried that it means undermining their methodological independence. And when you can affirm for them, no, the church is not asking you to do that, but the church is asking us to put it in this broader framework. They say, oh, if that's what you mean, I can do that. That doesn't disrespect my integrity or the integrity of my subject. So yeah, they're on board. Then they might have questions practically, I haven't been trained how to do this, and then we get into nuts and bolts like that. But the hurdle for a lot of them is like reassuring them that you respect the rightful independence of science, but you want to make some distinctions about what science does and what is not its task.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And I mean, you've already mentioned this, but if you take out, you can't just leave the app. I mean, obviously, you can't make the vacuum. If you pull out the Catholic nature of things, the sorts of questions you ask with philosophy, it almost always gets replaced with other less philosophically sound. I mean, so the questions are still being, like you said, the questions are still being asked. It's just, or maybe they're not being asked. Other assumptions are made, or other philosophical things are made, and so it seems like that's you can't get. I think so. It's good that people are seeing that, and it's good that you're pointing that out. That this isn't the proper science or the proper area to ask this question. This is what science does, or this wasn't what philosophy does. But yeah, yeah. Otherwise, there's lots of confusion.
The pretense to neutrality always comes with assumptions and implications, and you might not say them out loud. Often you won't, because you don't even realize that you're making your assumptions and their implications. But the kids will pick up on it, right? If the pretense to neutrality means that you can't make any claims about ultimate meaning, kids pick up this sense that either there isn't an ultimate meaning or that they have to like make it up or whatever, which is not an adequate answer. And we see the consequences of it all around. But yeah, like that, I say it all the time. There is no neutral. And if you're pretending to be neutral, your actual philosophy is less likely to be coherent because it hasn't been examined, right?
I remember talking with one of my at a secular school, one of my physics professors when I was in engineering school, and I'd come right out of a Thomas Aquinas college with lots of philosophy and theology and all of these things, and I was asking like, why aren't we asking questions about why here? And he was basically saying, dismissing like, oh, we're not concerned about any of those things, and And it was like at the time it's like, well, okay, I see this isn't what, physics can get to, sort of thing, but still, isn't everybody ultimately concerned with the question, those other questions that even go beyond two, that you want to have those things, and he kind of just waved it off like, no, no, we don't talk about those sorts of
We
things,
don't
even
do
though,
that here.
yes,
Right.
right,
So if your school says the most important questions that humans ever ask are not the real work of education, because here we learn skills for the job market. That's a very bold claim about what human life is all about,
right.
right? And it's one that does not lead to human happiness and human flourishing. And we can see the consequences. I would say one major consequence of it is rise in political extremism, because political extremism on the left or the right substitutes for meaning making, right? It's like, well, here's something worth putting a lot of your time and energy into. Here's something maybe worth living and dying for, because everybody wants something like that. And if what is on offer in what we call education doesn't at least acknowledge that that's a sort of central aspect of human life, then people are going to go looking for it. And, given the conditions with social media and everything else, more and more people are going to be pushed to political extremism. People imagined that the decline of religion would mean the decline of religious extremism because they link those two things. In fact, it's been exactly the opposite. Decline of religion has led to the increase in political extremism because religion, and not that there's not distorted religion, but religion, when it's healthy, um, takes your central focus off of politics and says, like, trust not in princes. Like the final questions that make your life matter or not matter won't be solved in the next election. But but if the next election, as every single one is the most important one in the history of our country, right? Um, then then maybe it's worth shooting somebody for, right? And that's what you get, you know.
Yeah.
I wasn't planning on that rant, but there you have it.
Oh, that was good. That was good.
Right. So homeschooling gives you a really unique opportunity, I think, to do this well. And I think a lot of homeschoolers do it well almost by instinct. If you yourself have an integrated Catholic worldview, um, it's going to come out. You might need some encouragement or some advice about how it relates to this or that topic or question. I found that homeschoolers are pretty good at sharing resources around those kinds of things, right? So there's a lot that happens naturally in a lot of homeschooling contexts that works really well with this. There's a couple things that you might consider though. One is um, if you homeschool in a way that keeps all the disciplines in a silo, right? We do math, done. We do science, done. We check the box, but we don't zoom out and ask bigger picture questions about what these things mean or how they relate to one another. Then we've got a bit of a missed opportunity. So our style of homeschooling was fairly freewheeling, and I know like that depends a lot on personality types and kids and all the ages, whatever. So I'm not saying to be successful you have to be just like us, but one of the advantages of that was the opportunity for cross-curricular connections. And so I would encourage people to watch for the opportunities to ask big picture questions, to not get just focused in on the particular skill or the knowledge that you're working on today in order to check the box. Um, and that religion is not just one other subject that has content that you need to know, though of course it is in one sense, but it's the framework through which we make sense of the other things. So if we use language or numbers or play sports or whatever it is that we do, right? We can think about those activities or those um, pieces of content or whatever from the point of view of like a vision of the human person as a unique creature with a unique vocation within creation and the potential for relationship with God, that is actually mediated through all of these other things, right? It's not like religion is a thing over here and then like you do math and you do ELA and you do social studies, but like the question of the human person and their purpose in this life and the next and their relationship with God is mediated through math and language and social relations and the natural world and um, friendly or highly competitive sports or what, like all of it, right? And so I would encourage us to not think of religion as one subject among many, but as the worldview that informs how we make sense of why these other things are worth our time at all. Because we could, in theory, homeschool where we teach religion the way we want it taught. But then we teach math or English with the same attitude that the world brings to math or English, which is it's like a skill you need so you can work in an office job. I don't think that's super common among homeschoolers, but maybe we might just ask ourselves, to what degree does our practice reflect that worldly attitude, and how might we be more intentional about thinking about these very human activities from a religious point of view. So that's one kind of consideration. And then on others, this would take forever, but I mean, you can, read the book if you're interested. You can just practice yourself thinking about the different disciplines from a Catholic point of view. I think the dinner table is like a huge amount of homeschooling happens at the dinner table. Like I'm not officially in charge of the curriculum. Like my wife does that. She's home with the kids. But when I get home, we just talk about whatever. And you ask questions. A lot of times asking questions is better than giving answers. I asked my kids the other day because a teacher mentioned this to me in one of my workshops. She was going to ask her, grade 2 student. She was an elementary school music teacher. Why do you think God created music? Right? So learning about music is one thing, but thinking about like, why do we live in a world that has music? Because God created music and there must be some purpose. Well, that's a different kind of a question. So as an experiment, I asked my own kids, why do you think God created music? And they had some interesting answers. And one of them said, I don't think God did create music. I think music is exactly the kind of thing that God didn't create. And so you could say like, well, that's wrong. Or you could say, tell me more about that. Like, what is this? What's behind this claim? And then he said, well, look, humans create music, but humans are observing patterns in the natural world, and they're making sense of those things. And in a certain sense, when they make music, they're trying to replicate some beautiful thing that they perceive in the world. And all this kind of stuff. I was like, well, that's at least interesting. Like, if nothing else, right? And so my point now when I share that with teachers is like, if you have a kid who says, who questions the premise of your question and says like, God didn't create music, you don't have a problem. You have an opportunity. And then as the other kids started weighing in here, it turned out that, a lot of the disagreement actually hinged on the definition of the words we were using, which is so often the case, right? But they learned that through experience of like open questioning and exploring and whatever else. And like I'll find a meme someone shared on Facebook that's like got a half truth in it, and I'll share the meme and just say like, what do you think? And like the kids get really good at picking that apart and finding what's true and why they would say it, but also how they missed a step here, and it doesn't mean what they think it means, even though, right? There was one about how colors aren't real. Colors aren't real because of the way the human eye works. And it turns out it's a philosophical mistake. Colors are actually real, but there was still something to learn about our subjective experience of them, and there are colors that we can't see that aren't within, all this kind of stuff. Anyways, I just sort of throw that stuff out there at them, like throw them a half-baked idea and let them fight with it, and let the open and they love it. Like they find it interesting. They don't find, whereas if they just had to like get the right answer, like are colors real or not real, or I don't know what, that would be boring in a certain sense. But to explore like the premises and what people are using the different language to use and how someone else might take the question differently than they took it and go in another direction. Like, so that's what our house looks like, is those kinds of open-ended conversations. And then the kids are very good at thinking, which comes in handy, but they're also really good at engaging people. right? So then they learn how to talk to people who don't share their presuppositions. They learn how to challenge assumptions that other people may not realize that they had, but in a charitable way where we're seeking truth together rather than I'm trying to prove you wrong because I'm a Catholic and I know all the things and you don't, which tends not to have a great success rate because people don't like being condescended to, as it turns out, you know. So a lot of the way you have conversations in your home is really formative for the way your kids have their attitude towards other people and other ideas, without ever, by the way, compromising on the truth. You don't have to be a relativist to say, let's think through different possible answers people might give to this question and think about why and what their assumptions are and what the implications of that are, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
It seems actually somewhat important, even as a teacher or as a homeschooling parent as well, to like, so I can have a conversation with the child about like, why do I have to learn algebra 2, Dad? And I'm like, yeah, interesting concepts there with the, moving things around, factoring out and developing these skills. It's like, but when am I going to use this, Dad? And it's, well, if it's all about use, you're not going to use it. Actually, probably in the fields you're interested in, you'll never use this in your life. But if so, is this actually something I should be making my child do? I can ask as a parent too. Or is the skill or the skills or the mental work that the child is doing with this valuable in itself beyond, will I need it for a job?
Right, right. I think about this one a lot. I mean, so on the one hand, everything is interesting, including algebra 2, because everything is an encounter with reality. And so there's a certain sense in which things don't need justification in the utilitarian sense. On the other hand, there's a practical infinity of things you could study, and you actually have to pick between them. So it's worth, judging their relative merits to some degree. Although there is time to just learn about cheese if that's your thing, right?
Yes.
Um, but the other thing I think is really related to what you said. We have this idea. I think it's very easy for children to get the idea that what they do in school is like produce outcomes. Like they're going to produce completed math exams or workbooks or essays or whatever. And like the world does not need more grade 9 essays and the world does not need more completed math books. We have plenty of them and we're just going to recycle them. Like what we need is people who have written essays and people who have completed grade 9 algebra 2 textbooks, right? The product, for lack of a better term, I'm using my scare quotes for people who can't see me. The product is not what the kids produce, it's the kids, right? We're trying to form human beings. And so the question about algebra 2 is what kind of person am I becoming through my practice of this? Am I becoming more capable of certain kinds of things? Am I developing some virtues? Um, and if the answer is no, well, then maybe I'm doing it wrong, or maybe there's other content that would be better suited to reach these goals. But the answer, the distinguishing question is not just will I use this in a job one day? It is how is it forming the kind of person I'm becoming? And then maybe algebra 2 isn't, not every single kid needs to take calculus in high school. The
Right.
answer might be no, given the fact that there's a million other things you could learn. But at least let's have the criteria correct. The criteria isn't when will I use this uh, from some practical point of view in the job market. It's how is it forming who I am becoming?
Yeah. Seems to go hand in hand, and you've mentioned it a couple times already. The search for truth. Where does that fall in this whole scheme of things?
Once truth is not on the table, right? Once we're just learning skills or facts that are true in as far as they go, but have no relationship to questions that matter in your life, right? Once truth is like abstracted from, or as Stephen was saying, like once certain kinds of questions about truth are like just not what we do here, right? Everything gets boring. Like incredibly boring, right? Whereas the pursuit of truth for its own sake is inherently interesting. Like people do Sudoku puzzles, not because anyone's going to pay them, not because they can put it on their resume, right? They do it because the search for truth is in itself satisfying. Um, And I'll use this example when I'm working with teachers. You know, it can happen in math class where you're working on a math problem, but it can happen when you're reading a good book or playing a game that you love or making music or whatever. You lose track of time. And like that's really worth what is happening to the human person when they lose track of time? Well, one way to think about it is that they're participating in eternity, right? Because pursuing truth for its own sake doesn't need justification, doesn't and then suddenly and kids have all actually experienced this, although maybe fewer of them nowadays. Teachers tell me that it's harder to generate these experiences with kids who've grown up on screens and all this kind of stuff. But there's a real sense in which when you pursue something that's genuinely good for its own sake, then time kind of falls away, right? And so education is I mean, one definition is a pursuit of truth. Another definition, which is related to that, is it's an encounter with reality, right? I like to think of education as an encounter with reality, and each of the particular disciplines being a different lens onto reality, right? Poetry is a certain lens onto reality, and chemistry is a different kind of lens onto reality, but it's the same reality, and 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 it's true. And those things are naturally interesting. Poetry and chemistry are naturally interesting because there's truth. But if there wasn't truth, if any poem you could write was merely arbitrary and any scientific discovery you could make was merely arbitrary, then none of it is interesting at all. And so, I think humans naturally were made for truth, and we suffer when that gets taken away from us. I think the mental health crisis, there's lots of factors, but I think one big one is that our culture has just abstracted from the big questions that humans ask, and we've limited our horizon to such utilitarian questions that, why should you care about anything? Why should you do anything? If you look at unemployment among young men, it's hard to measure because you usually measure unemployment by people who are looking for work and can't find it. But they're not even looking. Some huge percentage of men who are at their typically most productive years. You think of any culture that's achieved anything great, from building, majestic architecture to exploring to whatever, right? A huge amount of the labor has been done by men in their 20s, whether it's intellectual labor, physical labor, whatever it is, right? These are people who have a ton of energy at that time of life, and a huge chunk of them are expending it on porn and video games and marijuana. That's like never mind the individual tragedies in all that. From a cultural point of view, the massive loss of creative energy that we have because people don't have a reason to do anything, right? And that's because we've abstracted from questions of truth. People are better off struggling with a truth that they don't yet agree with than just having nothing presented at all. Picture Jacob wrestling with God, right? I tell teachers, make the proposal to the kids. They don't even have to agree with it. Your goal isn't to get everyone to agree with you. Make a proposal and give them something to wrestle with, right? And then even maybe they come to agree with you. Maybe they come to disagree with you. Maybe they're wrong, but at least they care. At least it matters, I will take the honest, sincere, caring atheist over the whatever, every day of the week. Do you know Chesterton's novel, The Ball and the Cross? It's the atheist and the hardcore Catholic who they want to have a duel, and the world won't let them duel. And so they run all over England trying to find a place where they can kill each other. And they end up becoming great friends because they realize that they're the only people who care about anything at all. They don't end up killing each other. But anyway.
I wonder, I mean, I haven't thought this through clearly, but I wonder, with the young men, especially today, after generations of teaching people that, need to learn skills to work, to do these things, and then something intuitive says, well, that's not worth it.
Right,
That's not a worthwhile existence. So why bother? Why not
right,
just
Yeah.
resort to these things?
right. And technologically, we're getting to a place where we can support significant amount of people who aren't working. And in some ways that's good because there's some people who can't work. And it's great if we can support people who can't work by all means. But it's actually not a great life if you're capable of doing more than video games and marijuana, but you don't. Like that's not the promised land, right? Oh, hey, we don't have to work anymore. Oh, turns out that doesn't make you happy.
Right.
Yeah.
Even if there's plenty of food in mom's fridge upstairs, right?
Mm-hmm. Stephen was sharing with me a story you related about illustrating the idea of first and second causes.
Yeah. Yeah, with your daughter Dorothy, you had mentioned this, and I'm not sure how it fits in the context of our conversation here, but it was just such a beautiful story to talk about, like, deep things coming out of everyday experiences and the importance of learning. I'm sure you know
Yeah.
but
It's a big leap. Sorry.
yeah,
Sure.
It's
No,
like a big shift.
I'm happy to share the story, and there might be connections because it is a story about different levels. I mean, it's a story about different levels of causality, but that goes to questions of meaning as well, right? Because meaning is a different layer of question than um, how does it work? And so there is some parallel there, I think. So here's the story, and I use it to say to elementary school teachers, some of the stuff that I share with them about science and that kind of thing seems like it's appropriate for a high school audience where you're making careful philosophical distinctions. But I say, like, look, we can actually have these conversations with very little people, and this will be applicable, I think, to your homeschooling audience, right? Because this is an example from home. Um, we're expecting our seventh child, and Dorothy is 6 at the time of the story, so like 5 years ago now. So Dorothy's 6, Mama's pregnant with little Martha, and 6-year-olds have questions when Mama's going to have a baby, right? So Dorothy comes up to me one day and says, Dad, you and Mom make babies, right? It's like, yes, we do. She kind of had me there. There wasn't much point denying it at that stage. And she said, but I thought God made babies. I said, well, that's right. Actually, God does make babies. She says, how does that work? All right. So this is a great question. And what I say to science teachers is the content is different, but this is the same question that your middle schoolers and high schoolers have about the Big Bang or evolution. If there is a naturalistic explanation, what does that mean about God, right? We understand human procreation from a naturalistic point of view. Within the proper methodological independence of biology, we can explain where babies come from. Oddly enough, no one says we know where babies come from, therefore there is no God. But they do say we know about evolution, therefore there is no God, or we know about the Big Bang, therefore there is no God. Well, actually, it's the same problem. If you know where babies come from, and God is just a competitor to naturalistic explanations, well, then any naturalistic explanation should be enough to do away with that fantasy, right? So, anyways, I said to Dorothy, well, bring me something that you colored. So she brings me something because Dorothy's coloring all the time. So she brings me something, and I said, was this colored by a marker? And she says, yes. And I said, but I thought you colored it. Now, I'm ready to make the philosophical distinctions, right? We're going to talk about Thomas Aquinas and primary and secondary causality and how higher order causes can transcend lower order causes without overpowering or manipulating or coercing them, but actually working through them. I didn't need to say anything. Dorothy got it. It took her maybe 2 seconds, and she says, "Oh, I get it." She understood from the analogy that she wouldn't even say that she colored half of it and the marker colored half of it. She understood to such a degree that the marker at its own proper level of causality colored all of it. And Dorothy at her own proper level of causality colored all of it and worked through the lower order cause. And so then it just wasn't a problem for her at all that God creates babies through this natural causality, right? And like you can go to, I didn't with Dorothy at the time, but with other children at other times, we went deeper on this because then they say, okay, well, Dorothy is free and the marker is not free. So then like how does that relate to God's relationship with creation and all this kind of stuff? Because one of the problems people will have with something like evolution is to say, well, it's predicated on chance, which is analogous to freedom in a way, right? Because you imagine, well, the marker wasn't just going to make a decision outside of Dorothy's control that she would then be in some kind of competition with. But if you say there's like chance in the natural order, then God seems to have a problem, right? Because then God's plan might get upset by some randomness. Now, Thomas Aquinas said, you know, given a universe with chance or given a universe without chance, the one with chance works a lot better with God, right? Because if there's no chance, everything is predetermined. And then there's no room for freedom or anything else. So he actually says chance works with you know, so this, and he wasn't arguing with any post-Darwinist or anything. He just was dealing with the fact that he was aware of chance in human relations and the natural world and whatever else. All these questions were dealt with before Darwin, even if Darwin puts them in a particular pointed way. But then I got to this by working this out with my kids. I said, look, humans use chance to achieve predictable outcomes all the time. Have you ever been to a casino? They don't need to load the dice to get predictable outcomes, right? You set the parameters and the rules, and given a large enough sample set, you get the outcome. So if human beings can work through genuine chance to achieve predictable outcomes, I don't think it's beyond God's capacity, right? Chance in nature does not cripple God's providence. And if it did, it would be a problem long before we got to evolution. The simple fact that your parents met was chance, and that their parents met was chance, and that their right, like, was chance in some sense, right? And so none of us would be here without like an amount of chance that you could never calculate. And you don't need evolution to see that that's a problem. And that the tradition had already thought that through long before Darwin. We often get this story that once Darwin showed up, we had to go back and rethink everything, and now we're like doing this rearguard action. No, we had thought this stuff through, and in fact, most of it is pretty straightforwardly applicable. Like John Henry Newman was alive when On the Origin of Species was published. He's the most important Catholic theologian living at the time, and he looked at it and he was like, "Nah, might be true." Like, he was just like not bothered in the slightest. All the things that we're told are supposed to be a big problem, he was like, if that's true, and it might be, then God's really even better than we thought. That was kind of his answer. It wasn't a rearguard action. It was just a sort of, oh yeah, that could fit. That sounds a bit like the God I know.
Right.
Well, I like how you connected that. Sorry to have made that big leap. That was
no, it was fun. It was fun.
Yeah. Yep.
Little curveball there.
Yeah. I like hitting the curveball.
Well, good. So in the time we have left with you today, tell us about your podcast that you have and other ways that folks can find out more about you and learn more about your work.
Yeah. So the podcast is the Making Every Class Catholic podcast, which you can find on Spotify and YouTube and Substack and probably anywhere else because they all connect in ways that I don't understand. I just started the Making Every Class Catholic newsletter, which is on Substack. You can sign up for that for free. There's more. If you want more, you can sign up for more and pay, I don't know, I think it's $8 a month or something, but the newsletter is free. And makingeveryclasscatholic.com is kind of the center place if you want to go dig me up, find me for speaking engagements, anything like that. Yeah, I have a YouTube channel. I've stopped doing things on Twitter because Twitter is mostly for fighting, and that's not how I want to spend my time. So I do very little on there. Facebook group, Making Every Class Catholic Facebook group, you could sign up for or for free again. So those are some easy ways to get a hold of me. And of course, you can try get the book Educating for Eternity. I always recommend support your local Catholic or Christian bookstore if you can. If you can't, my next recommendation is the osvbookstore.com. Support the small Catholic publisher. And, it's also available in other places where everyone knows how to look that destroy the profit margins of authors and booksellers. But sometimes it's your only option, so I won't judge you.
Yes, that's true. Okay, well, our show notes will have links to all of that, so folks can head there after this episode finishes. A couple of episodes have come to mind as we've been talking. One of them is with Dr. Daniel Kuebler that Stephen mentioned earlier. We've had the pleasure of visiting with him twice now, and he was recently talking to us about his new book about evolution, published by Word on Fire. So we'll link that episode. There's another episode that with our one of our Kolbe Academy online teachers, Kim Crawford, discussing literature through a Catholic lens that I thought of as we were talking about that earlier. So I'll link that so folks can check that out if they haven't already heard that.
I would love to check that out.
Yeah.
And I will say that Dr. Kuebler was a recent guest on Thinking Faith.
Yes.
So if anyone is interested in checking that, he's excellent. I recommend him without reserve. So.
Yeah, we have enjoyed our time visiting with him, and I caught that episode of yours as well. I will link that in the show notes so folks can check all those out. Thanks, Dr. Salkeld, for coming to visit with us. It's really been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me. God bless.
Subscribe to the Kolbecast on your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss an episode. And let us know how we're doing by leaving a rating or a review. And as always, feel free to email us at podcast@kolbe.org.
Mary, our Mother, pray for us. St. Maximilian Kolbe, St. Ignatius of Loyola, holy saints and angels, pray for us. Ad Maiorem Dei Gloriam.